The mahogany courtroom fell silent as Judge Hamilton's gavel echoed through the chamber. Vanessa Mitchell stood frozen, her coffee-stained apron still tied around her waist, staring at the legal documents that would change everything. Behind her, the Blackwood family sat in stunned disbelief as their carefully constructed world crumbled in a matter of minutes. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Just a waitress, Margaret Blackwood had sneered just hours earlier. What could she possibly know about running an empire? Now, those words hung in the air like bitter smoke as the judge's declaration reverberated through the room. The entire Blackwood estate, valued at $47 million, is hereby transferred to Miss Vanessa Mitchell. But this story didn't begin in that courtroom. It began 3 months earlier in a small diner called Murphy's Corner, where Vanessa served coffee and dreams in equal measure. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Vanessa's cramped studio apartment at 5:30 in the morning. She rolled over, her body aching from another double shift at Murphy's Corner Diner, and squinted at the crack of sunlight filtering through her threadbare curtains. The radiator clanked and wheezed, barely warming the small space she called home. Vanessa swung her legs over the side of her narrow bed and felt the cold linoleum floor shock her bare feet awake. She'd been living in this tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's laundromat for 3 years now, ever since she'd aged out of the foster care system. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were quiet, and it was walking distance to the diner where she'd worked since she was 18. She shuffled to the kitchenette, really just a hot plate and a mini fridge tucked into the corner, and started her morning ritual. Instant coffee, 2 slices of day-old bread from Murphy's, and a multivitamin she bought at the dollar store. Breakfast of champions, she thought, with a wry smile. At 6:15, Vanessa tied her dark hair back in a simple ponytail and wrapped her worn denim jacket around her shoulders. The October morning carried a sharp bite that cut through the thin fabric. But she'd learned to ignore discomfort long ago. She'd learned to ignore a lot of things. Vanessa was refilling the napkin dispensers when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see an elderly man in an expensive charcoal suit, completely out of place among the diner's usual clientele. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair swept back and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His shoes alone probably cost more than Vanessa made in a month. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Sit anywhere you'd like," Vanessa called out, grabbing a menu from behind the counter. The man chose a corner booth, the one with the view of both the street and the rest of the diner. Vanessa approached with her usual smile, the one she'd perfected to mask whatever she was really feeling. "What can I get you started with? Coffee?" "Please." His voice was cultured, with the slight rasp of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. "And perhaps you could recommend something from the menu? I'm not familiar with the local cuisine." Vanessa studied him for a moment. He wasn't being condescending, just honest. "The meatloaf special is Eddie's pride and joy. Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. It's not fancy, but it's good." "That sounds perfect." As Vanessa poured his coffee, she noticed him watching her with unusual interest. Not the leering attention she sometimes got from lonely truckers, or the dismissive glances of business people slumming it for a cheap meal. This was different. Calculating, almost. "Have you worked here long?" he asked. 3 years. Vanessa set the coffee cup down carefully. "You passing through town?" "Something like that." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You have excellent instincts, miss." Vanessa Mitchell." The man went very still. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, and for a moment, Vanessa thought she saw something like recognition flash across his features. "Mitchell," he repeated slowly. "And you're how old, if you don't mind me asking?" 21. Vanessa felt a familiar discomfort creeping up her spine. "Look, if this is some kind of—" No. He set his cup down and looked directly at her. "Forgive me, I'm Theodore Blackwood. I represent the Blackwood family estate." The name meant nothing to Vanessa, but something in his tone suggested it should. Okay. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, do you know anything about your family history? Your parents? Quote. Vanessa's expression hardened. This was territory she didn't discuss with strangers, or really with anyone. I was in foster care, never knew my parents. Your birth certificate lists your mother as Sarah Mitchell, is that correct? A chill ran down Vanessa's spine. How do you know that? Theodore reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio. Because, Miss Mitchell, I've been looking for you for a very long time. The diner suddenly felt too small, too warm. Vanessa gripped the coffee pot tighter, using its weight to ground herself. I think you've got the wrong person. Your mother's maiden name was Blackwood, Theodore continued, his voice gentle but relentless. She was the daughter of Harrison Blackwood, one of the wealthiest men in the state. She was also my client's sister. The coffee pot slipped from Vanessa's fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of glass and hot liquid. Eddie looked up from the grill, concerned about creasing his weathered face. Is everything okay over there? Fine, Vanessa called back, her voice strained. She knelt to clean up the mess, using the moment to steady herself. You're lying. I'm afraid I'm not. Theodore slid a photograph across the table. This is your mother at age 19, before she left home. Vanessa's hands trembled as she picked up the black and white photo. The woman looking back at her had the same dark hair, the same stubborn chin, the same eyes that stared back from mirrors. It was like looking at herself in period costume. I don't understand, Vanessa whispered. Your mother fell in love with a man your grandfather disapproved of. When she refused to end the relationship, Harrison cut her off completely. She left town, changed her name back to Mitchell, and disappeared. We've been searching for her, and you, ever since. Why? Theodore's expression grew grave. Because 3 days ago, the last legitimate heir to the Blackwood fortune died. According to the will and the laws of inheritance, you are now the sole beneficiary of an estate worth $47 million. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She sank into the booth opposite Theodore, her mind reeling. That's impossible. I have all the documentation. Birth certificates, DNA tests we can run, legal precedents. The Blackwood family has been fighting this for months, but the law is clear. The family? Harrison's son Richard and his children, they've been running the family businesses since Harrison's death 5 years ago. They're not pleased about this development. Vanessa looked around the diner, at Eddie flipping burgers, at the cracked vinyl and flickering neon. 3 hours ago, this had been her entire world. Now this stranger was telling her she was an heiress to a fortune she'd never dreamed of. I need proof, she said finally. Of course. Theodore opened his portfolio and began laying out documents. Here's your mother's original birth certificate, listing her as Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood. Here's the private investigator's report, tracking her movements after she left home. And here's the will, clearly stating that in the absence of direct heirs, the estate passes to the next blood relative. Vanessa stared at the papers, the legal language swimming before her eyes. What happened to her? My mother? Theodore's expression softened. She died when you were 3 months old. Car accident. Your father died 2 weeks later from injuries sustained in the same crash. You went into the system because no one knew to look for family. The grief hit her unexpectedly, sharp and fresh despite the years. She'd always wondered, always imagined scenarios where her parents might still be alive, might come looking for her. Now she knew the truth, and it hurt more than the uncertainty ever had. I need time to think about this, Vanessa said. I understand, but Miss Mitchell, there's something else you should know. The family is already taking legal action to contest the will. They're claiming undue influence, questioning the validity of the documents, arguing that you're unfit to manage such substantial assets. Unfit? You're a waitress, with no formal education, no business experience, no social connections. In their minds, you're exactly what your mother was when she left, a liability. Quote, the condescension in those words, even secondhand, ignited something fierce in Vanessa's chest. She'd spent her entire life being underestimated, being dismissed, being told she wasn't good enough or smart enough or worthy enough. Now she was supposed to accept that from people who'd never had to work a day in their lives? What do I need to do? Theodore smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. We fight. Theodore's law office occupied the entire 15th floor of the Meridian building downtown, a glass and steel monument to corporate success that made Vanessa feel impossibly small. She stood in the marble lobby, her best dress, a simple black number she'd bought at Goodwill for job interviews, feeling inadequate among the expensive suits and clicking heels surrounding her. The elevator ride to Theodore's office was silent, except for the soft jazz playing overhead. Vanessa caught a reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized herself. She'd spent the morning at a salon Theodore had recommended, trading her usual ponytail for a sleek professional cut and adding subtle makeup that made her look older, more serious. Miss Mitchell, Theodore's secretary greeted her warmly. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in the conference room. The conference room was intimidating in its elegance. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and walls lined with legal texts that probably cost more than Vanessa's monthly rent. Theodore stood at the windows, his silhouette sharp against the afternoon skyline. Punctual, he noted, approvingly as she entered. An excellent trait for someone about to inherit a business empire. I'm still not sure I believe any of this is real, Vanessa admitted, taking a seat at the massive table. That's understandable. Yesterday you were serving coffee. Today you're potentially one of the wealthiest women in the state. Theodore moved to his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. But before we proceed with the legal formalities, there are things you need to know about what you're inheriting. He spread documents across the table like a dealer laying out cards. Financial statements, property deeds, corporate structures, a maze of wealth and responsibility that made Vanessa's head spin. The Blackwood Empire consists of several key assets, Theodore began, settling into the chair beside her. First, there's Blackwood Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate with contracts throughout the Southeast. Annual revenue last year was $18 million. Vanessa stared at the number, trying to comprehend what $18 million even looked like. Then there's the real estate portfolio, the family estate in Millbrook Heights, of course, but also commercial properties downtown, a vacation home in Charleston, and several rental properties throughout the county. He pulled out photographs of sprawling mansions, gleaming office buildings, and pristine waterfront properties. Each image seemed to belong to a different world than the one Vanessa had known. There are also the investments, stocks, bonds, trust funds, that have been growing for 3 generations. Conservative estimates put the total liquid assets at around $12 million. And the family just runs all this? Richard Blackwood has been the primary decision-maker since his father's death. He's expanded the manufacturing business considerably and has a reputation as a shrewd negotiator. His daughter Jessica handles the real estate investments, while his son Marcus oversees the financial portfolio. Theodore paused, studying Vanessa's expression carefully. They're not going to welcome you with open arms. Because I'm nobody. Because you're a threat to everything they've built their identities around. Theodore leaned forward, his expression serious. The Blackwoods have been the most prominent family in this city for over a century. They sit on charity boards. Their names are on hospital wings. They're part of an exclusive social circle that most people can only dream of entering. And now some waitress from the wrong side of town is going to inherit it all. Exactly, Theodore smiled grimly. They've already hired Pemberton, Matthews and Associates to contest the will. They're arguing that you're unfit to manage such substantial assets, that the inheritance laws shouldn't apply because your mother was disinherited, and they're questioning the validity of the genealogical evidence. Vanessa felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. What if they're right? What if I am unfit? Fitness isn't determined by where you come from, Miss Mitchell. It's determined by what you do with the opportunities you're given. Theodore gathered the documents into neat piles. Which brings me to my next point. If you decide to proceed with this, you'll need to prepare for a battle. Quote, what kind of preparation? Legal preparation, certainly, but also personal preparation. The Blackwoods will scrutinize every aspect of your life, looking for ammunition to use against you. They'll paint you as a gold digger, an opportunist, someone who can't be trusted with serious responsibility. Vanessa thought about her tiny apartment, her secondhand clothes, her complete lack of college education. They won't have to look very hard. On the contrary, they'll have to work very hard to discredit someone who's been supporting herself since age 18, who's never been in trouble with the law, who's respected by her coworkers and neighbors. Theodore's voice grew firm. Don't let them convince you that poverty equals unworthiness. Before Vanessa could respond, Theodore's secretary knocked on the conference room door. Mr. Blackwood? The Blackwood family's representatives are here for the meeting. Vanessa's stomach dropped. Meeting? I arranged a preliminary discussion, Theodore explained quickly. Nothing formal, just an opportunity for both sides to assess the situation before we end up in court. You might have mentioned that. You might have refused to come. The door opened and 3 people entered, their presence immediately commanding the room. Richard Blackwood was in his late 50s, tall and imposing with steel gray hair and the kind of tan that came from golf courses and yacht clubs. His daughter Jessica appeared to be around 30, blonde and beautiful in the way that money made possible, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than Vanessa's car. Marcus, the son, looked to be in his mid-20s, with his father's build and his sister's confidence. They moved like people accustomed to being the most important individuals in any room they entered. Theodore, Richard's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades issuing orders. I assume this is the young woman making the rather extraordinary claims about our family. Richard, Jessica, Marcus, meet Vanessa Mitchell, your half-niece, and, according to the law, the rightful heir to your father's estate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jessica's perfectly applied smile didn't waver, but her eyes were ice cold as they assessed Vanessa from head to toe. How interesting, Jessica said finally. And you've been working as a waitress all this time? Quote, There's nothing wrong with honest work, Vanessa replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Of course not, Marcus interjected smoothly. Though it does raise questions about your ability to manage complex financial instruments and business operations. I'm sure she's very competent at what she does, Richard added with barely concealed condescension. But running a multi-million-dollar enterprise requires a rather different skill set than taking breakfast orders. Vanessa felt heat rising in her cheeks, but Theodore placed a subtle hand on her arm, a reminder to stay calm. What exactly are you proposing? Theodore asked. Richard exchanged glances with his children before responding. We're prepared to offer Miss Mitchell a generous settlement. $2 million, with the understanding that she relinquishes any claim to the Blackwood estate. The number hung in the air like a challenge. $2 million was more money than Vanessa had ever imagined having. Enough to change her life completely. She could buy a house, go to college, travel, never worry about rent or grocery bills again. And if I refuse? Then we'll see you in court, Jessica said sweetly, where we'll present evidence that you're unfit to inherit, that the genealogical evidence is questionable, and that allowing someone with no business experience to control such substantial assets would be irresponsible. We'll also demonstrate that your mother was legally disinherited, and that inheritance laws shouldn't apply retroactively, Marcus added. Vanessa looked around the conference room, at the expensive furnishings and the commanding views, at the family who'd grown up with every advantage while she'd grown up with none. She thought about Eddie at the diner, about the other kids who'd aged out of foster care with nothing, about every person who'd ever looked at her like she didn't belong. Keep your settlement, she said quietly. Richard's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? I said, keep your settlement. Vanessa stood, surprised by her own composure. If this is rightfully mine, then I'll fight for it. Jessica's perfect facade cracked slightly. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Maybe not, Vanessa admitted, but I know what it's like to have nothing. And I know what it's like to work for everything I have. Maybe that's exactly the kind of experience this family business needs. The Blackwoods exchanged looks that could have frozen champagne. This is a mistake, Richard said coldly. We were trying to be generous, to spare you the embarrassment of a public legal battle you cannot win. We'll see about that. As the Blackwood family filed out of the conference room, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision, Jessica turned back at the doorway. "Enjoy your 15 minutes of fame, sweetheart, because that's all this is going to be." When the door closed behind them, Vanessa sank back into her chair, adrenaline making her hands shake. "Well," Theodore said mildly, "that went better than expected." "Better? They just declared war on me." "Exactly, and you didn't back down." Theodore began gathering the documents, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Now the real work begins." "What happens next?" "Next, we build a case that proves beyond any doubt that you are Sarah Blackwood's daughter and the rightful heir to the estate. We document every asset, every business relationship, every legal precedent that supports your claim." Theodore paused in his organizing and looked directly at Vanessa. "And we prepare you to become the kind of woman who can walk into any boardroom in this city and command the same respect they do." "How do we do that?" "The same way you've done everything else in your life," Theodore replied, "one day at a time, with more determination than they think you possess." Outside the conference room windows, the city sprawled beneath them, full of possibilities and challenges Vanessa had never imagined. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and ambitions was her future, if she was strong enough to claim it. The transformation began the next morning. Theodore had arranged for Vanessa to take a leave of absence from Murphy's Diner, though she insisted on working her final week to help Eddie find temporary coverage. Her days were now divided between crash courses in business management, meetings with financial advisors, and preparations for the legal battle ahead. "Corporate law isn't just about knowing the rules," explained Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the business professor Theodore had hired as Vanessa's tutor. They sat in a private study room at the university library, surrounded by textbooks on economics, finance, and business strategy. "It's about understanding how power works, how deals are made, and how to read the people across the negotiating table." Quote, Vanessa absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone who knew her future depended on it. She studied financial statements until she could spot discrepancies at a glance, memorized the names and backgrounds of every major business leader in the city, and practiced speaking with the kind of confidence that commanded respect rather than asking for it. Meanwhile, Theodore's investigative team was building their case. DNA samples had been collected and sent to 3 independent laboratories for verification. Private investigators were tracking down every document related to Sarah Blackwood's departure from the family, interviewing former servants and neighbors who remembered the scandal. "The DNA results came back," Theodore announced during one of their afternoon strategy sessions. "All 3 labs confirm a genetic match. You are definitively Sarah Blackwood's daughter." But the Blackwoods weren't sitting idle. Their counterattack began subtly. Whispered conversations at the country club, carefully planted stories in the local society pages, suggestions that the mysterious claimant to the Blackwood fortune was nothing more than an opportunistic fraud. The first public salvo came from an unexpected source. Vanessa was leaving the library after another tutoring session when a reporter from the Herald Tribune approached her in the parking lot. "Miss Mitchell? I'm Jake Morrison from the business section. I understand you're claiming to be the lost Blackwood heiress?" Vanessa had been coached for this moment. "I'm not claiming anything. The legal documentation speaks for itself. But surely you understand why people might be skeptical. A waitress suddenly appearing with claims to one of the city's most prominent fortunes?" "I understand that people make assumptions based on appearances," Vanessa replied carefully, "but the law doesn't recognize class distinctions when it comes to inheritance rights." Morrison scribbled notes on his pad. "The Blackwood family released a statement this morning questioning the authenticity of the genealogical evidence. They suggest this might be an elaborate fraud perpetrated by someone hoping to exploit their recent loss." The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Vanessa kept her expression neutral. The DNA evidence from 3 independent laboratories would suggest otherwise. "Assuming the samples weren't tampered with. That's a serious accusation to make without proof." Quote, Morrison smiled in a way that reminded Vanessa of a predator circling wounded prey. "Sources close to the family indicate they have evidence that casts doubt on your mother's true identity. Care to comment?" Vanessa felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "I think this conversation is over." She walked away, Morrison's voice following her across the parking lot. The public has a right to know if someone is trying to defraud one of our city's most respected families. That evening's paper featured a front-page story with the headline, "Mystery Woman Claims Blackwood Fortune, Family Cries Fraud." The article painted Vanessa as a calculating opportunist who had somehow manufactured evidence to support an outrageous claim. It quoted, quote, anonymous sources close to the family suggesting that the real Sarah Blackwood had died childless and that the woman claiming to be her daughter was an imposter. They're trying to control the narrative, Theodore explained over dinner at an upscale restaurant where he was helping Vanessa learn the social skills she'd need in high society. Classic public relations strategy. Discredit the opponent before the legal battle begins. It's working, Vanessa said, pushing food around her plate. She'd received 3 calls that day from reporters wanting to interview her, and twice that many from curiosity seekers who'd somehow gotten her phone number. Half the city thinks I'm a fraud. The other half is rooting for the underdog, Theodore countered. Don't underestimate the power of a good David and Goliath story. But the pressure was mounting. Vanessa's neighbors at the apartment complex had started watching her with suspicious interest. The grocery store clerk, who'd known her for years, suddenly treated her like a celebrity or a criminal. She couldn't tell which. Even Eddie at the diner had grown awkward around her, as if her potential wealth had created an invisible barrier between them. The breaking point came during a business etiquette lesson at Theodore's office. Dr. Hendricks was teaching Vanessa about board meeting protocols when Theodore's secretary burst in without knocking. Mr. Blackwood, you need to see this immediately. She handed him a tablet displaying a news website. Theodore's face darkened as he read, and Vanessa felt her stomach clench with dread. What is it? Theodore turned the screen toward her. The headline read, Alleged Blackwood heiress has criminal record, juvenile arrests revealed. The article detailed Vanessa's arrest at age 16 for shoplifting, a desperate attempt to steal food when her foster placement had fallen through and she'd been living on the streets for 3 days. The charges had been dropped and her juvenile record sealed, but somehow the information had found its way to the press. How did they get this? Vanessa whispered. Money opens doors that should stay closed, Theodore replied grimly. This is a serious escalation. The story spread quickly through social media and local news outlets. By evening, it had been picked up by regional papers, complete with commentary about how criminal behavior in youth often predicted adult misconduct. The comment sections were brutal. Strangers dissecting her character, questioning her motives, calling her everything from a gold digger to a career criminal. Vanessa sat in her apartment that night, staring at the laptop screen filled with hateful comments from people who'd never met her. The walls felt like they were closing in, and for the first time since this began, she wondered if she should have taken the settlement money. Her phone rang. Theodore's name appeared on the caller ID. Don't read the comments, were his first words. Too late. I'm calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. We need to get ahead of this. Maybe they're right, Vanessa said quietly. Maybe someone like me has no business inheriting this kind of wealth. Someone like you, Theodore's voice sharpened. You mean someone who survived foster care? Someone who worked to support herself while most people her age were partying in college? Someone who never took anything she didn't earn? Someone with a criminal record. Someone who made one mistake as a desperate child and learned from it. Vanessa, I've spent 30 years representing wealthy families, and I can tell you that most of them have done things far worse than taking food when they were hungry. The difference is they had money to make their problems disappear. There was a long pause before Theodore continued, his voice gentler. The question isn't whether you deserve this inheritance. The question is whether you're going to let them intimidate you into walking away from what's rightfully yours. The next morning brought a new development. Theodore's office had received a formal legal challenge to the DNA evidence filed by Pemberton, Matthews, and Associates on behalf of the Blackwood family. They were claiming that the samples had been contaminated and demanding new tests under court supervision. It's a stalling tactic, Theodore explained as they reviewed the motion. They're hoping to drag this out long enough to destroy your credibility completely. Can they do that? They can try, but every delay gives us more time to build our case. Theodore spread new documents across his desk. And we found something interesting. He handed Vanessa a faded photograph of a young woman standing beside a vintage car. The woman looked exactly like the photo Theodore had shown her of her mother, but this one was different. It showed her pregnant. We found this in your mother's belongings, stored in a safety deposit box she opened before she left town. The bank records show she made regular deposits there, even after she supposedly had no money. Vanessa studied the photo, trying to imagine the woman who had carried her, who had made the impossible choice to leave everything behind for love. There's more, Theodore continued. Your mother didn't just disappear. She was in contact with Harrison Blackwood right up until she died. We found correspondence between them, letters where she begged him to acknowledge his granddaughter. He knew about me? He knew, and according to these letters, he was planning to change his will to include you before he died. The Blackwoods have been suppressing this evidence. For the first time since the newspaper attack, Vanessa felt hope stirring in her chest. Can we prove it? We're going to do more than prove it. We're going to make them pay for trying to bury you the same way they buried your mother. Theodore's expression had turned predatory, and Vanessa realized she was seeing the lawyer who had built his reputation on taking down powerful families who thought they were above the law. What do we do next? We go on the offensive. No more playing defense, no more letting them control the story. Theodore began gathering the documents with renewed energy. It's time to show this city exactly who the Blackwoods really are. Outside the office windows, storm clouds were gathering over the city skyline, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. But for the first time since this battle began, Vanessa wasn't afraid of the storm. She was ready to become one. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters positioned themselves for the best camera angles. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Vanessa sat in the back of Theodore's Mercedes, watching the media circus through tinted windows, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Remember, Theodore said, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror, confidence without arrogance. Answer only what's asked. And don't let them bait you into losing your temper. Vanessa nodded, smoothing the fabric of her navy blue suit. Designer, but not ostentatious. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully calculated to project competence and respectability. Gone was the uncertain waitress from Murphy's diner. In her place sat a woman who had spent 2 months preparing for this moment. The Blackwood family had already arrived, their legal team forming an impressive phalanx around the courthouse entrance. Richard Blackwood stood at the center, his silver hair gleaming under the morning sun, speaking confidently to reporters about defending his family's legacy against fraudulent claims. Jessica and Marcus flanked him, their expressions a perfect blend of concern and determination. They look like they're running for office, Vanessa observed. They're running for something much more valuable, public opinion, Theodore replied. But we have advantages they don't expect. As they approached the courthouse, the crowd of reporters surged forward. Microphones thrust toward Vanessa's face, questions shouted over each other in a cacophony of professional aggression. Miss Mitchell, how do you respond to allegations that you're defrauding the Blackwood family? Is it true you've been coached by lawyers to impersonate the real heir? What would you say to people who think a former criminal shouldn't inherit millions? Vanessa paused at the courthouse steps, Theodore's hands steady on her elbow. She looked directly into the cameras, her voice clear and unwavering. The evidence will speak for itself. I'm here to claim what legally belongs to me, and I have complete faith in our justice system to determine the truth. Inside the courthouse, Judge Hamilton's courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The front rows were filled with members of the city's elite, their expensive clothing and jewelry creating a stark contrast to the plain wooden benches. Vanessa recognized faces from the society pages. Business leaders, charity board members, people who had never set foot in a diner, but were fascinated by the spectacle of old money defending itself. The Blackwood legal team had spared no expense. Lawrence Pemberton himself, the city's most prominent attorney, led their defense. His reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination was legendary, and his presence sent a clear message about how seriously the family took this threat. Your Honor, Pemberton began, his voice resonating with the authority of 3 decades in prestigious courtrooms, We are here today because a young woman of questionable character has fabricated an elaborate scheme to defraud one of our community's most respected families. He gestured toward the Blackwoods, sitting in the front row like a portrait of American aristocracy. The Blackwood family has contributed immeasurably to this city's prosperity. They've built businesses that employ thousands, donated millions to charitable causes, and maintain the highest standards of civic responsibility for 4 generations. Pemberton turned to face Vanessa, his gaze calculated to intimidate. In contrast, we have a woman with a criminal record who worked as a waitress until 2 months ago, when she suddenly appeared with dubious documents claiming to be the lost heiress to a $47 million fortune. The words hit their mark, and Vanessa felt the weight of judgment from the packed courtroom. But Theodore had prepared her for this attack, and she maintained her composure, meeting Pemberton's stare without flinching. Theodore rose for his opening statement, his movements deliberate and confident. "Your Honor, my client is indeed a waitress, a hardworking woman who has supported herself since aging out of foster care at 18. She never sought this inheritance, never even knew she had family until we found her." He moved to the evidence table, lifting a folder thick with documents. But the law doesn't require worthiness assessments before granting inheritance rights. It requires proof of lineage, which we have in abundance. Theodore opened the folder, revealing the photograph of Sarah Blackwood. This is Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, daughter of Harrison Blackwood, born in this city in 1979. DNA evidence from 3 independent laboratories confirms that Vanessa Mitchell is her daughter. He placed the photo where the judge could see it clearly. The resemblance alone is striking, but science removes any doubt. Miss Mitchell is the last direct descendant of Harrison Blackwood, and under the laws of this state, she is the rightful heir to his estate. The first witness called was Dr. Margaret Chen, the geneticist who had supervised the DNA testing. Her credentials were impeccable. Degrees from Johns Hopkins and Stanford, 15 years of experience in forensic genetics, testimony in over 200 court cases. The probability that Miss Mitchell is not Sarah Blackwood's daughter is less than 1 in 10 billion, Dr. Chen testified, her voice matter-of-fact. The genetic markers are conclusive. Pemberton's cross-examination was brutal but ultimately ineffective. He questioned the chain of custody for the DNA samples, suggested possible contamination, and implied that the tests could have been manipulated. But Dr. Chen's expertise was unshakable, and her testimony stood firm under assault. The real surprise came when Theodore called Harrison Blackwood's former personal secretary, Eleanor Walsh, to the stand. She was in her 70s now, with silver hair and the dignified bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of trust and discretion. "Mrs. Walsh," Theodore began, "you worked for Harrison Blackwood for 32 years, is that correct?" "Yes, from 1972 until his death in 2020. "Were you aware that Mr. Blackwood had a daughter named Sarah?" Eleanor's voice was steady but sad. "Yes, Sarah was a beautiful, spirited young woman. Mr. Harrison loved her very much." "What happened to Sarah?" "She fell in love with a young man from a working-class family. Mr. Harrison disapproved and forbade the relationship. When Sarah refused to end it, he cut her off financially and told her she was no longer welcome in the family home." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. This was not the version of events the Blackwoods had been telling. "Did Sarah leave town?" "Yes, she moved away with the young man. We never saw her again." Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. It broke Mr. Harrison's heart, but he was too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. Theodore approached the witness stand with a manila envelope. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit G. Do you recognize this handwriting?" Eleanor examined the document, her expression growing grave. "This is Mr. Harrison's handwriting. It's a letter. Could you read the relevant portion to the court?" Quote. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she read, "Eleanor, I've learned that Sarah had a daughter before she died. My granddaughter has been in foster care all these years, while I wallowed in stubborn pride. I must find her and make things right. Please begin searching immediately. The family fortune should go to Sarah's child, as it would have gone to Sarah herself if I hadn't been such a fool." The courtroom erupted. Richard Blackwood's face had gone ashen, while Jessica and Marcus exchanged panicked glances. Pemberton shot to his feet, objecting strenuously, but the damage was done. "Mrs. Walsh," Theodore continued once order was restored, "did Mr. Blackwood ever mention changing his will to include his granddaughter?" "Yes. He was working on it when he died. He said he wanted to correct his greatest mistake." During cross-examination, Pemberton attacked Eleanor's memory, her motivations, and her loyalty to the family that had employed her for decades. But the elderly woman remained unshakable, her testimony consistent and compelling. "Mr. Harrison spent the last 5 years of his life searching for his granddaughter," she said firmly. "He knew he'd wronged his daughter, and he wanted to make amends." The afternoon brought character witnesses for Vanessa. Eddie Murphy took the stand, his nervous energy filling the formal courtroom as he testified about Vanessa's work ethic and integrity. Mrs. Chen from the laundromat spoke about Vanessa's kindness to elderly neighbors. A social worker from the foster care system detailed Vanessa's academic achievements despite difficult circumstances. But it was the final witness who delivered the knockout blow. Theodore called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the business professor who had been tutoring Vanessa. But her testimony wasn't about education. It was about a conversation she'd had with Marcus Blackwood. "He approached me 3 weeks ago," Dr. Hendricks testified, her academic credentials lending weight to every word. "He offered me $50,000 to testify that Miss Mitchell was unprepared to handle complex financial responsibilities." The courtroom fell silent. Marcus Blackwood's confident facade cracked, revealing something desperate and ugly beneath. "Did you accept this offer?" Theodore asked. "Absolutely not. I found it deeply unethical and reported it to the university administration." Pemberton's objections were overruled, and his cross-examination only made things worse. Dr. Hendricks had documented the conversation, including a recording she'd made on her phone when Marcus became increasingly aggressive about securing her cooperation. As the day ended, Vanessa felt cautiously optimistic. The Blackwood family's carefully constructed image was beginning to crumble, revealing the desperate measures they'd taken to maintain their grip on power. But she knew the battle wasn't over. Pemberton was too skilled to go down without a fight, and the Blackwoods had too much to lose to surrender easily. Walking down the courthouse steps, surrounded by shouting reporters and flashing cameras, Vanessa realized that regardless of the final verdict, she was no longer the same person who had served coffee at Murphy's Diner. The frightened girl who had aged out of foster care with nothing but determination was gone, replaced by a woman who could stand in any courtroom and demand justice. The real question now wasn't whether she deserved the inheritance, it was whether the Blackwood family deserved to keep it. The second day of testimony began with desperation. Lawrence Pemberton called Richard Blackwood to the stand, a risky move that revealed just how badly their case was unraveling. Richard maintained his composure as he testified about his father's mental state in his final years, suggesting that Harrison had been suffering from early-stage dementia and wasn't competent to make decisions about changing his will. "My father was a proud man," Richard said, his voice heavy with manufactured grief. The guilt over Sarah's departure affected him deeply. In his final years, he became obsessed with the idea that she might have had a child somewhere. Theodore's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Blackwood, your father continued running his businesses successfully until his death, correct?" "Well, yes, but he negotiated complex merger deals worth millions of dollars in his final year. That's different from... He was sharp enough to expand Blackwood Industries' government contracts by 30%. But not sharp enough to know his own mind about his will?" Richard's confident mask slipped. "My father was being manipulated by people who wanted to exploit his emotional vulnerability." "What people?" "He died before he could change his will, and before Miss Mitchell was even located." The contradiction hung in the air like smoke, and Richard's credibility evaporated with it. Jessica Blackwood's testimony was more polished, but equally damaging. She painted a picture of a family devoted to charitable causes and community service, emphasizing their contributions to local hospitals and schools. But Theodore demolished her carefully constructed image with a single question. "Miss Blackwood, isn't it true that your family's charitable foundation has been under investigation by the IRS for the past 2 years?" Jessica's perfect composure cracked. "That's a routine audit." A routine audit that discovered $23 million in questionable deductions and potential tax fraud. Pemberton's objections were sustained, but the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Marcus Blackwood never took the stand. After Dr. Hendrick's testimony about his attempted bribery, Pemberton wisely kept him away from cross-examination. Instead, they called a parade of business associates and social acquaintances to vouch for the family's character. But their testimony felt hollow after the revelations of the previous day. The turning point came when Theodore presented his final piece of evidence, a safety deposit box that had belonged to Sarah Blackwood, discovered by private investigators just days before the trial. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents that painted a complete picture of her life after leaving the Blackwood estate. "Your Honor," Theodore said, approaching the bench with a thick folder, Sarah Blackwood kept meticulous records of her attempts to reconcile with her father. These letters spanned 15 years, from her pregnancy through her daughter's early childhood. He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. In these letters, Sarah repeatedly reached out to Harrison Blackwood, informing him of his granddaughter's birth, her placement in foster care after Sarah's death, and her ongoing need for family. Theodore read from one of the letters, Sarah's words echoing through the silent courtroom. "Father, I know you're angry with me, but Vanessa is innocent. She's your granddaughter, your blood. She deserves to know her family, and the family deserves to know her. I'm not asking for money, I'm asking for love." The emotional weight of the words was devastating. Several people in the gallery wiped away tears, and even Judge Hamilton appeared moved by the young mother's desperate pleas. These letters prove that Harrison Blackwood was fully aware of his granddaughter's existence, Theodore continued. His search for her in his final years wasn't the product of dementia. It was the culmination of 15 years of guilt and regret. The final letter was the most damning. Written just months before Sarah's death, it contained a photograph of 3-year-old Vanessa and a heartbreaking plea. "She has your eyes, Father. She's brilliant and kind. Despite everything she's been through, I'm dying and I need to know that someone will love her when I'm gone." Theodore placed the photograph on the evidence table where everyone could see it. The little girl in the picture was unmistakably Vanessa. The same dark hair, the same determined expression, the same eyes that now stared back from the defendant's table. "Harrison Blackwood received this letter," Theodore said quietly. "He kept it in his personal safe for 20 years. When we opened that safe last week, we found something else." He produced a handwritten document, yellowed with age. A draft of a new will, written in Harrison's own hand, leaving everything to, quote, "my beloved granddaughter Vanessa Mitchell, daughter of my daughter Sarah Blackwood." The document is dated just 2 weeks before his death. The courtroom erupted. Richard Blackwood shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "That's impossible. My father never." "Order!" Judge Hamilton's gavel silenced the chaos. "Mr. Blackwood, sit down or you'll be held in contempt." Pemberton requested an immediate recess, his confidence finally shattered. During the break, Vanessa watched the Blackwood family huddle with their legal team, their animated gestures revealing the panic beneath their polished exteriors. "They're going to offer another settlement," Theodore predicted. "Something substantial this time." He was right. During the recess, Pemberton approached with an offer of $15 million and a public acknowledgement of Vanessa's legitimacy as Harrison's granddaughter. In exchange, she would relinquish all claims to the remaining estate and agree to a confidentiality clause preventing her from discussing the family's private affairs. "It's a good offer," Theodore admitted when they discussed it privately. $15 million would set you up for life." Vanessa stared out the courthouse window at the crowd of reporters still gathered on the steps. "What about justice? What about my mother's letters? What about Harrison's wishes?" "The law doesn't guarantee justice, only legal resolution. And this would be a significant victory. You'd go from nothing to $15 million. But they'd keep the rest. They'd keep pretending they're this perfect family while burying the truth about how they treated my mother." Vanessa turned back to Theodore. "I didn't come this far to accept half measures. The judge could rule against us. Juries can be unpredictable. and the Blackwoods still have significant influence in this community. Then let him rule, but I won't walk away from what's right. When court reconvened, Theodore declined the settlement offer. Judge Hamilton nodded approvingly. He'd clearly been moved by the evidence and respected Vanessa's determination to see the case through to its conclusion. Closing arguments were brief but powerful. Pemberton made a last desperate appeal to class prejudice, arguing that inheritance laws existed to protect established families from opportunistic outsiders. But his words rang hollow after the overwhelming evidence of Vanessa's legitimacy and the Blackwood family's attempts to suppress the truth. Theodore's closing was simple and devastating. Harrison Blackwood spent the last 5 years of his life trying to correct his greatest mistake. He died before he could formally change his will, but his intentions were clear. The law exists to carry out those intentions, regardless of how inconvenient they might be for those who benefited from his earlier error. Judge Hamilton retired to his chambers to consider his verdict. The wait stretched for nearly 3 hours, during which Vanessa sat in the courthouse cafeteria, oddly calm, despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. Win or lose, she had spoken her truth and honored her mother's memory. When they were finally called back to the courtroom, the tension was electric. Judge Hamilton entered with the measured dignity of someone about to make a decision that would reshape lives and fortunes. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he began, his voice carrying throughout the packed courtroom. This court finds that the preponderance of evidence clearly establishes Vanessa Mitchell as the daughter of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood and the granddaughter of Harrison Blackwood. Vanessa's heart pounded as the judge continued. Furthermore, the evidence demonstrates that Harrison Blackwood intended to recognize Miss Mitchell as his heir and to correct what he viewed as a grave injustice committed against his daughter. While his formal will was never amended, the documentation of his intentions, combined with the legal principles governing intestate succession, compels this court to honor those wishes. The judge's gavel fell with finality. The entire Blackwood estate, including all business interests, real property, and financial assets, is hereby transferred to Miss Vanessa Mitchell, effective immediately. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits, desperate to file their stories. The Blackwood family sat in stunned silence, their perfect world shattered in the span of a single sentence. And Vanessa sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. 6 months later, Vanessa stood in the executive suite of Blackwood Industries, looking out over the city she now helped shape. The transition hadn't been easy. The business world was as challenging as Theodore had warned, and learning to navigate boardrooms and investment portfolios required the same determination that had carried her through foster care. But she'd made changes that mattered. The company's charitable foundation was restructured to focus on education and support for foster children. Employee benefits were expanded, wages increased, and ethical business practices became non-negotiable standards. The Blackwood family had left town quietly, their appeals exhausted, and their reputation in ruins. They'd taken their settlement, a smaller portion of the liquid assets, and disappeared into the anonymity they'd never expected to need. Murphy's Diner still stood on the corner of Pine and Harbor, but now it bore a plaque, the Sarah Blackwood Foundation for Foster Youth, because everyone deserves a chance. Eddie Murphy had become the foundation's first director, ensuring that kids aging out of the system would have the support Vanessa had never received. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Vanessa thought about the young woman who had served coffee just 7 months earlier. That person felt like a stranger now, someone who had existed in a different lifetime. Her phone buzzed with a text from Theodore. "Board meeting prep tomorrow at 9. Don't be late, boss." Vanessa smiled, straightening her shoulders as she prepared to leave the office. She had an empire to run, a legacy to honor, and a mother's dreams to fulfill. The waitress was gone. The heiress had work to do. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.